Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? The mysterious visitor. The gas lamps along Baker Street flickered faintly in the evening mist, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. The faint echo of footsteps could be heard, the rhythmic tapping of shoes only interrupted by the occasional cough or the distant clatter of a carriage wheel. A sense of unease hung in the air, for it was the hour just before twilight, that peculiar moment when the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the night to fall. Dr. John Watson, sitting by the hearth in his modest quarters, glanced at his watch. It was nearly 6 o'clock, and his thoughts had been drifting toward a quiet evening with a good book. But as he set the book aside and made to close the curtains, the doorbell rang sharply through the silence of the apartment. "That sounds like a summons for you, Watson," came the voice from the shadows of the study, unmistakable in its dryness. Watson turned to see his companion, the great Sherlock Holmes, sitting at his usual place by the fireplace. Holmes had been unusually quiet this afternoon, his sharp eyes hidden behind the veil of his introspective mood. He had been absorbed in some trivial paper or another, but the moment the bell rang, it was clear his attention had shifted. "Not another case, surely?" Watson said with a sigh, though he knew better than to ask. Holmes rose swiftly, his lean figure cutting through the gloom of the room like a shadow in motion. He did not respond, but his eyes gleamed with that unmistakable glint of curiosity that often preceded the onset of a new mystery. He reached for his coat with a practised grace, his fingers lingering for a moment over the fabric, then turned back to Watson. "Let us see what this visitor has to offer. I suspect it may be rather curious," Holmes remarked, his voice almost too calm, betraying an underlying excitement that Watson knew all too well. Watson followed, grabbing his medical bag instinctively. Though his profession was in medicine, his association with Holmes had made him a constant companion in the detective's various investigations. As they descended the stairs from the second floor of 221B Baker Street, the door swung open to reveal the visitor. A tall man, draped in a black cloak, stood at the threshold. His face was pale, and his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. He was breathing heavily, as though he had run a great distance to arrive here. In one hand he clutched a letter, and in the other an old-fashioned walking cane, though his grip was trembling. I need your help," he said, his voice hoarse, like a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. I believe I am in great danger." Holmes did not move immediately. His piercing gaze swept over the man, taking in the slightest detail. The man's dishevelled appearance, the nervous twitch of his hand, the erratic manner in which he held his cane. It was not uncommon for people to seek Holmes's assistance in times of distress, but this visitor seemed different. "Come in," Holmes finally said, stepping aside to allow the man to enter. "You are in no condition to stand outside, particularly in such weather. Watson, if you would." Watson nodded and ushered the man into the sitting-room, where he promptly sank into an armchair with a sigh of relief, though his body remained tense, as if every second was an additional weight on his chest. Holmes studied him from across the room, folding his arms in front of his chest, his expression unreadable. "Now," Holmes began, his voice steady and deliberate, "what precisely brings you to our door? And why, I wonder, do you appear as if you have seen a ghost?" The man glanced at Holmes nervously, then slowly opened the letter in his hand. He laid it out on the table, revealing an elegantly penned note that appeared to have been written in haste. Holmes inspected the letter, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The note read, "To Alexander Thorne, your fate is sealed. By the stroke of midnight, all will be lost. Your only hope lies in the hands of those who see beyond the veil. Come to them before it is too late. A friend." The visitor, whom Holmes had already deduced to be Alexander Thorne, a man whose name had been mentioned in a few high society circles, looked up at Holmes with an expression of desperation. "I received this letter earlier today," Thorne began, his voice shaking slightly, "but it is not the first of its kind. I've been receiving strange warnings, cryptic messages, and now this." He pointed to the letter, his finger trembling as if he could no longer bring himself to touch it. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Warnings? Tell me, Mr. Thorne, what have these messages been saying? And why do you fear them so?" I don't know," Thorne replied, his voice faltering. "It started a week ago. Strange occurrences at my estate. Items misplaced. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't have. And then I found a man dead on my doorstep. I thought it was a cruel joke. But when I looked closer, I saw the mark, a symbol carved into the man's chest. It was as though he were marked for death." Watson, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. "A symbol? What was it?" Thorne's eyes flicked nervously to the floor, as though afraid to say it aloud. "A serpent, wrapped around a dagger." Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile, his mind already working at a rapid pace. He took a step closer, placing his hands behind his back as he circled the man with the practised ease of a hawk sizing up its prey. "A serpent and a dagger," Holmes mused aloud. "A classic motif in both occult and criminal circles. This could be a case of symbolic murder, perhaps. Or something far more complex. And yet you seem rather calm for a man who has just witnessed a murder, Mr. Thorne." Thorne gulped audibly, his voice wavering as he explained further. "It's not just the death. It's the prophecy. The letter. It speaks of my doom and the man who was found. He was holding a prophecy of his own, a warning for me. And that is why I am here, because I fear the prophecy is true." Holmes raised an eyebrow and exchanged a brief glance with Watson, who was now equally intrigued by the man's words. "Very well," Holmes said, his voice suddenly colder, sharper. "You are in the right place, Mr. Thorne. But I must warn you, there are many layers to this puzzle, and the truth may be far darker than you can imagine." As the rain began to fall, beating steadily against the windows, Holmes began his work. The pieces of this new mystery were still scattered, but Holmes could already see the outlines of the pattern. And soon the fog of deception would begin to clear. But for now, all that was clear was one thing. Someone was playing a dangerous game, and Thorne was caught in the middle of it. The game had only just begun. The web tightens. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. casting flickering shadows on the walls of the sitting room. Alexander Thorne sat in the chair across from Sherlock Holmes, still clutching the letter with trembling hands. His eyes darted nervously about the room, though his discomfort seemed more about the words he had spoken than the silence that hung between them now. Holmes, as usual, was unbothered by the quiet. He had a mind capable of analysing 100 thoughts at once, and this case was already proving to be a stimulating puzzle. Watson sat on the edge of the armchair, his fingers drumming absently on the wooden armrest. He couldn't help but feel an uneasy tension in the air. Something about this entire affair felt too rehearsed. The man was clearly frightened, but it wasn't simply fear of death or the supernatural. There was something deeper, something lurking in the recesses of his mind. Holmes, however, had no such reservations. His mind worked in sharp, precise movements, as if each piece of the puzzle were falling into place with an audible click. "Mr. Thorne," Holmes began, breaking the silence, his voice smooth and measured. "You say this prophecy is linked to the death of a man on your doorstep. But tell me, what was this stranger's connection to you?" Thorne opened his mouth to answer, then hesitated. His gaze shifted toward the floor, as though searching for the right words. I didn't know him, at least not directly," Thorne said finally. "He was a traveller, someone who had come to my estate several weeks ago. He had an odd air about him, distant, like he wasn't fully present. I thought little of him at the time, but now I wonder." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "And yet you found him dead, lying on your doorstep. Surely such an event would have drawn more of your attention." Thorne shuddered, as though reliving the moment. "I wasn't there when he was found. He had been lying there for several hours before I returned. It was only after the servants alerted me that I saw him, his body. It was as though he had been waiting for me." "And the mark on his chest," Watson interjected, trying to keep pace with Holmes's probing questions. "This symbol you spoke of, the serpent and dagger. Do you think it's connected to the prophecy?" Thorne nodded, his lips pressed tightly together, as though he had never voiced these thoughts aloud before. "Yes, I do. I cannot explain it fully, but there was a certain knowing look in his eyes, as though he had been expecting his own demise, and mine as well. He must have left the letter for me before he died. But the prophecy. I've been trying to make sense of it. It seems as if something terrible is going to happen before the stroke of midnight." Holmes paused, his eyes fixed on Thorne. "And what is it that you fear most, Mr. Thorne? This is no ordinary letter. It bears a sense of finality, does it not?" Thorne's breath caught in his throat, as if he were reluctant to speak the next words aloud. "I fear that I am being drawn into something. I don't understand. A trap, perhaps, or something even more sinister. I don't know who to trust any more." Holmes stood up, his mind already working at full speed, analysing Thorne's every word, every nervous gesture. He motioned for Watson to follow as he moved toward the window, his thoughts turning inward for a moment. "I believe Mr. Thorne may be correct," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to Watson. "This is no mere coincidence. The letter, the death, and now this prophecy. All of it points to something deeper, something beyond a simple criminal act. The symbol on the man's chest, whether occult in nature or a deliberate act of misdirection, suggests an intricate web of motives. Watson watched Holmes with a mixture of admiration and growing curiosity. "You believe this is part of a larger scheme, don't you?" "Indeed, Watson. This is but the first strand of a complex thread, and I suspect we shall discover more before long. But for now, we must examine the clues before us." Holmes turned back to face Thorne, his eyes cold and calculating. "Mr. Thorne, we shall accompany you to your estate. There, I intend to examine the scene of the crime and gather further evidence. If there is more to this prophecy than meets the eye, we will uncover it." Thorne's face paled, but he nodded, slowly. "Thank you. I cannot explain it, but I feel as though you are my only hope." As the words left his lips, a sudden shift in the atmosphere swept through the room. The air seemed heavier, as though the world outside had grown colder. Holmes, of course, was unaffected, his mind now entirely focused on the task ahead. He turned to Watson, his expression unreadable. "Watson, fetch your coat. We shall leave immediately." And shh! The fog had thickened by the time the trio arrived at Thorne's estate. The sprawling manor stood on a hill, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of a slowly darkening sky. The grounds were quiet, save for the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. A heavy silence lay over the place, broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching on the gravel pathway. As they approached the front door, Thorne paused for a moment, his hand resting on the brass doorknob. "This is where it happened," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I fear this is where it will happen again." Holmes said nothing, but his eyes flicked over the estate, noting the arrangement of the windows, the structure of the garden, and the faintest outline of movement behind the curtains. Everything seemed to be in place, but Holmes knew better than to trust appearances. The door creaked open, and they entered the grand foyer of the estate. The air inside was thick with the scent of polished wood and aged furniture. Thorne led them to a parlour at the back of the house, where the body had been found. The room, once filled with the warmth of a roaring fire, now felt cold and sterile. A faint trace of blood still stained the hardwood floor, and the shape of the body was marked only by the faintest outline in the dust. But it was the air in the room that held Holmes's attention. Something about it felt off, as though the space had been disturbed in ways that were not immediately visible. Holmes knelt down beside the outline of the body, his sharp eyes scanning the floor. His fingers brushed lightly over the surface, as though seeking something hidden beneath the layers of dust and debris. "Ah," Holmes said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It seems we have our first clue, Watson. There is something here." Something carefully concealed. Watson, intrigued, leaned forward. "What is it?" Holmes remained silent, for a moment, his eyes glinting with anticipation. "Patience, Watson. This is but the first piece of the puzzle. Let us see what else the room has to offer." As the investigation unfolded, it became clear. The mystery was only beginning to reveal its true depths. And with each passing moment, the game grew more dangerous, as Holmes moved ever closer to unravelling the dark secret that had brought them here. The night, it seemed, was far from over. The first clue. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he examined the dust-covered floor with keen interest. His fingers, deft and deliberate, traced the faint outline where the body had once been, then moved toward a small, nearly imperceptible scratch on the floorboard near the fireplace. The dim light of the parlour flickered around him, adding an almost spectral quality to the scene. Watson watched, silently observing the detective's every move, though his thoughts were far from clear. There was something unsettling about the entire situation, an almost palpable sense of dread in the air. Holmes's gloved fingers finally came to rest on the scratch, pushing at the wood with a gentle, probing motion. It was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but to Holmes it was a key. "Aha!" Holmes murmured, more to himself than to anyone else, before looking up at Watson and Thorne. "It appears we have our first clue, Watson." Watson leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What have you found?" Holmes stood up, his sharp gaze never leaving the floor. A subtle indentation, hardly noticeable, but clearly made by something heavy. This isn't just the mark of the body. It suggests that something was dragged across this spot, likely only a few hours after the man's death. Thorne, who had been standing nervously by the door, looked as though he wanted to speak but seemed unsure of himself. "Dragged?" he asked. "What does that mean?" Holmes turned to face him, his expression unchanged. "It means, Mr. Thorne, that someone attempted to move the body, or perhaps something else. What we know for certain is that it was not an accident. The body wasn't left where it fell." Thorne opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Watson raised a hand to halt him. "Holmes, do you think this was part of the original plan? The death, I mean." Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his mind racing as he reviewed the facts. "I do. This was no random killing. The symbol on the body, the serpent and dagger, it speaks of ritualistic purpose. But the act itself was too deliberate to be simple murder. Whoever is behind this planned it carefully. They knew exactly how the body would be found." Watson felt a chill creep up his spine. Ritualistic murder was a disturbing prospect, and the thought that Thorne might be involved in something so dark sent an uncomfortable shiver through him. But he knew better than to jump to conclusions without evidence. Holmes never acted on intuition alone. "So, you believe the body was moved after death?" Watson ventured, trying to focus on the facts. "Why? What could have been the reason?" Holmes was already pacing around the room, his mind clearly turning the problem over and over. "That is the very question. Why drag the body? To cover something up, perhaps, or to place it somewhere, for a reason. The fact that we are standing here suggests that the crime was meant to lead us here." Thorne swallowed audibly, his anxiety heightening. "But I've told you everything I know," he pleaded. I don't know what else to say. This prophecy, it's all so terrifyingly cryptic." Holmes paused, looking at Thorne with sharp, appraising eyes. "The prophecy, Mr. Thorne. You have mentioned it several times now, yet you've shared only a part of it. Do you have the full text? I believe it will offer more insight into the true nature of this case." Thorne hesitated, his eyes flickering as though weighing the decision. After a long, strained silence, he produced a small folded piece of parchment from his coat pocket and handed it to Holmes. Holmes took the parchment with a single fluid motion and unfolded it carefully. He scanned the words, his lips barely moving as he read them aloud, his voice soft but deliberate. The serpent coils beneath the moon's light, a dagger drawn with deadly might. Before the hour all will fall, and none shall escape the shadow's call. Seek the ones who wear the mask, for they shall guide you to the task. The words echoed in the room, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Watson stared at Holmes, uncertain of how the detective would interpret this new piece of the puzzle. "Interesting," Holmes muttered, almost to himself. "The prophecy is indeed more complex than I initially assumed." Watson, ever the sceptic, leaned in. "But what does it mean, Holmes? What are the ones who wear the mask?" Holmes tapped his chin thoughtfully. It could be a reference to a group, perhaps one that operates in the shadows, unseen. But the question is, why would they be involved in this? He turned to Thorne. "Have you ever encountered anyone who might fit this description? Anyone who hides their identity or operates in secret?" Thorne blinked, as though trying to pull memories from the depths of his mind. I can't say I know of anyone like that, but there are always whispers in the circles I move in. People who deal with matters no one else would dare discuss. Secret societies, occultists, there are always rumours." Holmes's gaze hardened, his suspicions growing. "Rumours, Mr. Thorne, can often be more revealing than they first appear. It's time we explored these whispers more thoroughly." Before Holmes could say more, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each passing moment. Watson's hand instinctively went to his medical bag, though he doubted he would need it for what was coming. He turned toward Holmes, who looked as calm as ever. His eyes narrowed in concentration. The door to the parlour opened with a creak, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a woman, tall and imposing, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her clothes were simple, but elegant, and her eyes, though soft, held a certain intensity that suggested both intelligence and purpose. She stepped into the room, her gaze sweeping over the three men. Thorne visibly stiffened at the sight of her, his face betraying a mixture of surprise and wariness. "This is Miss Helena Morrow," Thorne introduced, though his voice betrayed an edge of discomfort. "She is someone I've known for years." Holmes studied her without speaking, his eyes flicking over her in that sharp, calculating manner Watson had grown so accustomed to. It was clear that he was already piecing things together. Miss Morrow nodded to the group. "But it was Thorne," she addressed. "I have come to speak with you, Mr. Thorne. It is urgent. The situation has escalated faster than we anticipated." Thorne looked at her with a mix of relief and apprehension. "You're here, finally. I was beginning to wonder when you would arrive." "I was detained," Miss Morrow replied, her voice steady. "I believe you've involved someone else in this." She glanced at Holmes, her eyes narrowing for a brief moment before she turned back to Thorne. "But it's not too late. We need to act quickly." Holmes, never one to waste time, crossed his arms and fixed his gaze on her. "And what exactly is it you're trying to act against, Miss Morrow? What has brought you to this point?" Her expression remained inscrutable, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "I will explain everything, but only if you promise to keep an open mind. There are forces at play here that you will not understand until you see them firsthand." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "I find that highly unlikely. I am already aware that there are dark elements at work in this case, but what you must understand is that your fear may cloud your judgment. You must trust in the facts." Miss Morrow hesitated, but then nodded. "Very well, but time is running out. If we don't act soon, the prophecy will come true, and none of us will survive." With those words, the stakes of the case were raised higher, and Watson felt an even deeper chill creep down his spine. Holmes's gaze hardened, the intensity of his mind reaching its peak. "Then we shall waste no more time." The game was afoot, and there was no turning back now. The masked motive. Miss Helena Morrow's presence was unsettling in the dimly lit parlour. Holmes studied her with his usual unwavering intensity, but there was something about her poise and controlled composure that made him wary. He was used to dealing with mysterious figures, but she seemed to possess an air of quiet power, something more than just a woman drawn into a peculiar case. "Well, Miss Morrow," Holmes began, his voice low but commanding, "if you wish to proceed, you must explain yourself. We are all ears, but I must insist that you do not withhold anything. Every detail is essential." She nodded, the tension in her posture slightly relaxing. "I understand. This is a matter of life and death, and I fear we have little time to waste." Thorne had moved to stand beside her, but his gaze was still fixed on the floor, as though unsure whether to trust her words. The room felt heavy with unspoken tension, the shadows casting long, eerie forms across the walls. Miss Morrow began speaking slowly, carefully. "You must understand that the prophecy mentioned in the letter, while cryptic, is not just a mere prediction. It is a warning, but not one based on fate. Someone is orchestrating these events with purpose. They are using the prophecy as a veil to disguise their true intent." Watson furrowed his brow. "So you believe the prophecy is a manipulation?" "Precisely," she said. "A means to control, to move people and forces like pieces on a chessboard." Her eyes flickered toward Thorne. "Mr. Thorne's family has been involved in certain dealings for years. He's not a stranger to the influence of such figures." Thorne winced at her words, but said nothing. Holmes's sharp gaze flickered briefly toward Thorne, but he quickly redirected his focus. "And these dealings," Holmes continued, "are they connected to the masked figures you mentioned in the prophecy?" Miss Morrow hesitated, her face tightening. "They are. The ones who wear the mask are not literal masks, Mr. Holmes, but symbols of those who operate in the shadows, in secrecy. These are individuals, possibly a group, who have been working in the darkness for generations. I'm certain they are behind the death of the man found at Mr. Thorne's doorstep." Holmes turned back to Thorne. "Is this true, Mr. Thorne? Have you been involved with such a group?" Thorne's face darkened, but his eyes remained averted. I was, years ago. It was never something I could speak of openly, but I severed those ties long ago. The group, known only in whispers, is not something I wish to be a part of, and yet I fear they have not left me alone." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You severed ties with them, you say, yet the death of this stranger and the prophecy point toward your involvement. How can you explain this coincidence?" "I can't explain it, Holmes," Thorne replied, his voice strained. "But I fear it's no coincidence. I think this man's death was meant to lure me back into their web. I thought I was free of them, but perhaps I've been wrong." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "And what exactly did these dealings entail, Mr. Thorne? What were you involved in?" Thorne hesitated, but his gaze finally met Holmes. It was a group that trafficked in forbidden knowledge, in rare artifacts of power. Many of them were obsessed with things beyond the ordinary. Occult relics, ancient symbols, and rituals meant to control fate itself. I was never fully in, the centre of it, but I dabbled. I sought information, things to give me an edge in my business dealings. But then I realized what I was involved in. I saw the manipulation, the darkness, and I left." Holmes nodded slowly. "And yet, you did not take enough precautions. You see, Mr. Thorne, leaving such a group is never as simple as severing ties. The moment one enters their fold, they are bound in ways that do not merely disappear with distance." "Perhaps, but that was years ago," Thorne countered. "And yet I feel as if they have returned. The prophecy, everything. It all points back to me." Holmes's expression remained impassive. "I believe you, Mr. Thorne, but belief alone will not solve this case. We need to gather more facts." He turned to Miss Morrow, his eyes piercing. "Miss Morrow, how do you fit into this? Why have you come now?" She shifted uneasily under Holmes's gaze, but then met his eyes with unwavering resolve. "I have been watching Mr. Thorne, Mr. Holmes. I knew of his past with this group, and I believe I was sent to ensure he didn't make the same mistakes again. The man found on his doorstep. He was one of them, someone who had been sent to retrieve Thorne. I fear the group has decided to pull him back in." Watson frowned, his thoughts racing. "But how does this tie into the death? And how does the prophecy fit into all of this?" Holmes's lips parted, but he seemed to be lost in thought for a moment. "The prophecy is the key, Watson. It is a guide, a signal from the perpetrators. The serpent and dagger are not symbols of fate. They are tools of manipulation, of control. The reference to before the hour suggests a time-sensitive event, a plan that is already in motion." "But why involve Mr. Thorne?" Watson asked, his voice heavy with confusion. Holmes turned back to Thorne. "That, my dear Watson, is the question. The killers could have chosen anyone, but they chose Thorne. He is the link between the past and present, a symbol of unfinished business. I suspect they know something about him that we do not, something crucial to their plan." Thorne clenched his fists, his frustration evident. "If only I knew more. I'm just as lost as you are. I want nothing more than to be free of this curse." Holmes was already moving, his mind clicking into place. "We must continue our investigation at your estate, Mr. Thorne. There is something we are missing, a final piece to the puzzle. We must search your library, the place where you studied these forbidden artifacts. It's likely that we'll find more clues there." Thorne nodded, his voice barely audible. "I'll take you there." As the four of them walked toward the library, the weight of the situation seemed to press down on them all. There was no question in Holmes's mind that the answers lay hidden somewhere in Thorne's past. Whether he was willing to admit it or not, the library was vast, its shelves stacked with leather-bound volumes, some ancient, others more recent. The faint scent of dust and aged paper filled the air as Holmes moved quickly between the rows, his keen eyes scanning every title, every sprawl of parchment strewn across a nearby table. Miss Morrow and Thorne stood in the doorway, their presence lingering at the edges, yet both of them remained eerily silent, waiting for Holmes to uncover what they all knew was hidden within. These walls! Holmes's fingers brushed over a few books before stopping at an old tome tucked into a far corner, its spine cracked and yellowed with age. He carefully pulled it from the shelf and opened it, his eyes narrowing as they scanned the text. "This," Holmes muttered to himself, "this is the connection I was searching for." Watson joined him at the table, peering over his shoulder. "What is it?" Holmes's finger traced the inscription on the page. It was a symbol, a variant of the same serpent and dagger motif. "This book contains the same ritual described in the prophecy." Watson's heart raced. So, this was planned all along? "Indeed," Holmes said with grim finality. "We have only scratched the surface, Watson. But now we know who is behind this, and why." The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but with each step closer to the truth, the danger grew more apparent. The ritual's shadow Holmes turned the ancient tome carefully, his eyes scanning the intricate symbols and cryptic text. The pages were filled with strange writings, some in languages Watson could not even begin to recognize. At the center of the page was the serpent and dagger symbol, drawn with unnerving precision, as though it had been meant to convey something far more powerful than a mere decorative motif. Watson's heart pounded in his chest. The implications were slowly beginning to unfold. "What does it mean, Holmes?" Watson asked, unable to suppress his growing unease. "What is the connection between this ritual and the man found dead?" Holmes closed the book with deliberate care, his brow furrowed in thought. "The ritual is not merely symbolic, Watson. It is one of summoning and binding. A dangerous incantation intended to manipulate fate itself. The serpent represents deceit and transformation, while the dagger signifies a sharp, irreversible act. The meaning behind this is as clear as it is chilling. Someone is attempting to control the course of events. The death of the man was merely a part of the ritual, an offering, if you will." "An offering for what?" Watson whispered, the dread creeping up his spine. Holmes's gaze met Watson's with cold clarity. "A return to power, to control forces beyond our comprehension. These people, this group, whoever they are, believe they can shape the future by manipulating life and death." Thorne had remained silent for most of the conversation, but now he spoke, his voice tight with anxiety. "I knew they were dangerous, but I had no idea it was this extreme. I only thought they were after my money, my influence, not this." Miss Morrow, who had remained still in the background, moved forward, her eyes narrowed in thought. "The ritual is only one part of a much larger scheme, Mr. Holmes. The one who died, he was not a mere casualty. He was someone who held a key to unlocking the power this group desires. They've been looking for that key for a long time." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A key? And you believe this key is something Mr. Thorne possesses?" Miss Morrow nodded. "I do. I believe the prophecy was meant to lead us here, to this very moment. Mr. Thorne has something that they want, something connected to the ancient rituals described in the book, but they won't stop until they have it. Watson's thoughts swirled, trying to keep up with the increasing complexity of the situation. What exactly does Thorne have that is so valuable? And why was the man found on his doorstep? What was he supposed to do? Holmes looked at Thorne with renewed intensity. Mr. Thorne, the question is simple, but the answer is far more complicated. What exactly do you possess that connects you to this group? What could they have possibly wanted from you after all this time? Thorne looked like a man caught between the forces of the past and the present. He took a deep breath, his face pale. "I have no idea what they were after," he said, almost pleading. "I swear I never touched anything occult after I left them. I've tried to bury it all, to move on. But, Holmes pressed, his voice a quiet command. Thorne's hands trembled as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He hesitated before handing it over to Holmes, who took it with careful fingers. Inside was a small, ornate pendant, an amulet engraved with the same serpent and dagger motif from the book. Holmes turned the amulet over in his hand, inspecting the delicate engravings. The pendant was cold to the touch, its surface almost unnervingly smooth. I see," Holmes said softly. "It's not just any object. It's a key in itself, a key to unlocking something far greater." The room fell into an oppressive silence as the weight of the situation settled over them. Watson could feel his pulse quicken, a foreboding sense of danger hanging in the air like a thick fog. Holmes, however, seemed remarkably composed, his mind already several steps ahead. Holmes carefully placed the pendant on the table between them. "This amulet," he said, "was never meant to be a simple trinket. It is part of a much larger puzzle, one that, if completed, could grant its possessor incredible influence. I believe this is what has drawn the group back into Mr. Thorne's life." Thorne's voice cracked. "But I've never used it. I didn't even know what it was until much later. It was just a gift, a token from one of the leaders. I thought it was a symbol of their allegiance. I didn't know it was meant for something more." Miss Morrow spoke up, her voice strained with urgency. "That is precisely the issue, Mr. Thorne. The moment you held that amulet, you became a target. Whoever controls this amulet controls the power described in the ritual. It has been passed down through generations of this secret group, each believing it brings them closer to their ultimate goal." Watson felt a shiver of realization. So the man who was killed, he was after this amulet? Miss Morrow nodded. Yes, he had been sent to retrieve it, though it seems he didn't make it far enough. He was likely the last person who knew where the amulet was hidden. And now they will stop at nothing to get it. Holmes's gaze hardened as he studied the pendant once more. This is no longer a simple case of murder. It is part of something much larger, something that could destroy lives if it is allowed to continue. We must take action immediately. "But what can we do?" Watson asked, his mind racing. "This group is hidden, operating in the shadows. How do we stop them?" Holmes stood, his posture as rigid as ever. "We begin by uncovering their true intentions. There are more pieces to this puzzle, Watson, and I intend to find them. Mr. Thorne, Miss Morrow, I suggest we head to your family estate. It is there we will find the next clue, one that will guide us to the heart of this conspiracy." Thorn looked uncertain, but he nodded nonetheless. "If you believe it's there, Mr. Holmes, but I don't know what more there is to find. I've already told you everything I know." Holmes fixed him with a pointed stare. "The answers are not always where we expect them to be, Mr. Thorn. Often the most valuable clues are the ones we overlook, or are too afraid to confront." The room seemed to grow colder as Holmes picked up the amulet and tucked it safely into his coat. The quiet tension was broken by the sound of the clock ticking relentlessly in the background, a constant reminder that time was running out. The sea, prophecy, the ritual, and the death. It was all connected, and they were nearing the heart of something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. The journey to the family estate was a quiet one, the tension palpable in the carriage as the city's skyline gradually gave way to the fog-choked countryside. Watson sat across from Holmes, his thoughts a whirlwind of uncertainty. Every answer seemed to lead to more questions. The closer they got to uncovering the truth, the more complex and dangerous the case became. As the carriage turned down a long, winding lane, Holmes's eyes gleamed with determination. The next phase of the investigation was upon them, and with it the lingering question of whether they would be able to stop the forces at play, or whether they would be swept into the shadow of the prophecy themselves. The game, as Holmes had once said, was afoot, secrets beneath the surface. The Thorn family estate stood like a shadow at the edge of the fog-drenched moors, its sprawling grounds bathed in the dim glow of a pale moon. As the carriage came to a halt, Holmes's sharp eyes surveyed the surroundings, noting every detail. The overgrown ivy creeping along the stone walls, the long stretch of windows, and the eerie stillness that seemed to cling to the place like a second skin. I swear I never touched anything occult after I left them. I've tried to bury it all, to move on. But, Holmes pressed, his voice a quiet command. Thorn's hands trembled as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He hesitated before handing it over to Holmes, who took it with careful fingers. Inside was a small, ornate pendant, an amulet engraved with the same serpent and dagger motif from the book. Holmes turned the amulet over in his hand, inspecting the delicate engravings. The pendant was cold to the touch, its surface almost unnervingly smooth. I see," Holmes said softly. "It's not just any object. It's a key in itself, a key to unlocking something far greater." The room fell into an oppressive silence as the weight of the situation settled over them. Watson could feel his pulse quicken, a foreboding sense of danger hanging in the air like a thick fog. Holmes, however, seemed remarkably composed, his mind already several steps ahead. Holmes carefully placed the pendant on the table between them. "This amulet," he said, "was never meant to be a simple trinket. It is part of a much larger puzzle, one that, if completed, could grant its possessor incredible influence. I believe this is what has drawn the group back into Mr. Thorn's life." Thorn's voice cracked. "But I've never used it. I didn't even know what it was until much later. It was just a gift, a token from one of the leaders. I thought it was a symbol of their allegiance. I didn't know it was meant for something more." Miss Morrow spoke up, her voice strained with urgency. That is precisely the issue, Mr. Thorne. The moment you held that amulet, you became a target. Whoever controls this amulet controls the power described in the ritual. It has been passed down through generations of this secret group, each believing it brings them closer to their ultimate goal. Watson felt a shiver of realization. So the man who was killed, he was after this amulet? Miss Morrow nodded. Yes, he had been sent to retrieve it, though it seems he didn't make it far enough. He was likely the last person who knew where the amulet was hidden. And now they will stop at nothing to get it. Holmes's gaze hardened as he studied the pendant once more. This is no longer a simple case of murder. It is part of something much larger, something that could destroy lives if it is allowed to continue. We must take action immediately. But what can we do? Watson asked, his mind racing. This group is hidden, operating in the shadows. How do we stop them? Holmes stood, his posture as rigid as ever. We begin by uncovering their true intentions. There are more pieces to this puzzle, Watson, and I intend to find them. Mr. Thorne, Miss Morrow, I suggest we head to your family estate. It is there we will find the next clue, one that will guide us to the heart of this conspiracy. Thorne looked uncertain, but he nodded nonetheless. If you believe it's there, Mr. Holmes. But I don't know what more there is to find. I've already told you everything I know. Holmes fixed him with a pointed stare. The answers are not always where we expect them to be, Mr. Thorne. Often the most valuable clues are the ones we overlook, or are too afraid to confront. The room seemed to grow colder as Holmes picked up the amulet and tucked it safely into his coat. The quiet tension was broken by the sound of the clock ticking relentlessly in the background, a constant reminder that time was running out. The sea, prophecy, the ritual, and the death. It was all connected, and they were nearing the heart of something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. The journey to the family estate was a quiet one, the tension palpable in the carriage as the city's skyline gradually gave way to the fog-choked countryside. Watson sat across from Holmes, his thoughts a whirlwind of uncertainty. Every answer seemed to lead to more questions. The closer they got to uncovering the truth, the more complex and dangerous the case became. As the carriage turned down a long, winding lane, Holmes's eyes gleamed with determination. The next phase of the investigation was upon them, and with it the lingering question of whether they would be able to stop the forces at play, or whether they would be swept into the shadow of the prophecy themselves. The game, as Holmes had once said, was afoot, secrets beneath the surface. The Thorne family estate stood like a shadow at the edge of the fog-drenched moors, its sprawling grounds bathed in the dim glow of a pale moon. As the carriage came to a halt, Holmes's sharp eyes surveyed the surroundings, noting every detail. The overgrown ivy creeping along the stone walls, the long stretch of windows, and the eerie stillness that seemed to cling to the place like a second skin. There, nestled among a collection of dust-covered objects, was an empty space, an indentation in the wood, shaped precisely to hold an item. "The amulet," Holmes said, his voice colder now, as he ran his fingers over the indentation, "was meant to be here. This is where it once rested." Watson's breath caught in his throat. "You mean someone has already taken it?" "Most likely," Holmes replied, his face grim. and that means we are now racing against time. If they have the amulet, they can complete the ritual, and if that happens, there will be no turning back." Thorne's face turned pale, his entire body stiffening. "But who? Who took it?" Holmes turned, his eyes sharp with purpose. "We are not alone in this house, Mr. Thorne. The group that has been tracking you, they are here. And I believe we are about to come face to face with them." A cold chill settled over the room as the words hung in the air, and Watson felt the weight of the moment settle upon him. The game, it seemed, was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. They were not just solving a murder. They were in a race to stop something far more sinister from unfolding. Suddenly, the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways, sharp and purposeful. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the door, his body tensing in response. "They are here," Holmes muttered, his voice low and controlled. "Prepare yourself, Watson." Watson glanced at Thorne, who had paled further but stood resolute. The fate of the amulet, and possibly the world, hung in the balance. The time for answers had come. Now they would have to face whatever lay in the shadows. The silent confrontation. The two figures who entered the library were like shadows, their movements fluid and purposeful, yet there was no mistaking the tension that crackled in the air. Holmes, ever composed, did not flinch, but his eyes narrowed, calculating. Watson, though less accustomed to such high-stakes encounters, felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on his chest. The presence of these men, so silent and deliberate, felt like the arrival of a storm. One of the figures, tall and imposing, took a step forward, his voice muffled by the mask that concealed his face. "You are meddling with forces you do not understand, Mr. Holmes. Leave now, and we will ensure no harm comes to you." Holmes's lips curved into a slight smile, though it was not one of warmth. "I have no intention of leaving, and I suspect harm is already on its way, whether I stay or not." Watson's eyes flicked to the door, as though contemplating an escape route, but Holmes gave him a brief, almost imperceptible shake of the head. "Stay close, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice steady. "These men are skilled, but they are not invincible. We must play this carefully." Thorne, still pale and visibly shaken, edged closer to Holmes, his voice trembling. "What do they want, Mr. Holmes? Why are they here?" Holmes's gaze shifted to Thorne, his eyes scanning the man quickly, as though weighing his every word. "They are here for the amulet, Mr. Thorne, and it seems that you have been far more entangled in their plans than you first realized." One of the masked men stepped forward, his gloved hand outstretched toward Thorne. "The amulet is the key to everything, Mr. Thorne. You cannot possibly understand the power it holds, but you will soon enough." Holmes did not move, his focus entirely on the figure speaking. "What power is it that you seek? What is the true purpose of this ritual?" The masked man tilted his head slightly, an unsettling silence hanging in the air. Then, as if deciding whether to indulge Holmes's curiosity, he spoke again, his voice low and cold. "You would not believe us, even if we told you. But rest assured, the ritual is far older than you can imagine, and the amulet will grant us the strength to complete it." Holmes took a step closer, his face unreadable. "Strength, you say? What kind of strength could possibly come from such an object?" What is the ultimate goal of this ritual you speak of?" The other masked figure, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was a gravelly whisper, but there was an undeniable authority in it. "It is not for you to understand. We do not need your interference, Holmes. You have already seen enough." Without warning, he moved swiftly toward Thorne, a glint of steel flashing in his hand. Watson's heart skipped a beat as he instinctively reached for his own weapon, but Holmes was quicker, his eyes narrowing with calculation. The man with the dagger lunged, but Holmes was already in motion, stepping aside and grabbing a nearby candlestick from a side table. With a swift, practiced movement, Holmes used the heavy object to deflect the strike, sending the blade wide. Watson stepped forward, pulling his revolver from his coat. The tension in the room escalated, and the air seemed to thicken with every passing second. "Hold your fire, Watson," Holmes commanded, his voice steady but firm. "We do not need to escalate this yet." The masked man with the dagger took a step back, his eyes flicking to his companion. They exchanged a brief look, one filled with the unspoken understanding of their next move. Then, as though rehearsed, they both turned and advanced on Holmes simultaneously. Holmes's eyes flashed with sharp intelligence. "You may have the advantage in numbers, gentlemen, but I do not need to outmuscle you. I need only to outthink you." With a sudden motion, Holmes dropped the candlestick, sliding to the side with a fluidity that suggested years of training. One of the men miscalculated his step and collided with the heavy wooden bookshelf, causing a stack of books to fall to the floor in a loud, disorienting crash. Watson saw his opening. Without hesitation, he raised his gun and fired a single, precise shot at the floor just in front of the advancing man. The sound echoed through the room like a thunderclap. The man froze, startled and momentarily disoriented. "This doesn't have to be violent," Holmes said, his voice commanding, yet laced with an underlying coolness. "But if you insist on making it so, you will find we are better prepared than you think." The men paused, their eyes shifting back and forth between Holmes and Watson. For a brief moment, there was an uneasy standoff, neither side willing to make the first major move. But it was clear the tension was reaching its peak, and Holmes's next move could tip the scales. "Tell me, gentlemen," Holmes continued, his voice now calmer, almost conversational, "how many of your group are left to confront us? It's not too late to stop this madness. You still have time to reconsider your actions." The taller of the two figures narrowed his eyes, his voice low and menacing. "You have no idea what you're up against, Holmes. This is far bigger than you, than any of us. The ritual must be completed." Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile. "Ah, so there is more to this than simply the amulet. You intend to use it to complete your ritual. But why? What is it that you hope to achieve? Immortality? Power? A seat at the head of some long-lost kingdom?" The man's eyes glinted dangerously behind the mask. "That is not for you to know." Holmes stood motionless, seemingly unbothered by the threat. "I think perhaps it is time for you to leave, gentlemen. We have no more patience for your games." Before either of the masked figures could react, Holmes made his move. With a sudden quick movement, he grabbed a nearby brass candelabra from the table and swung it with precision, knocking the knife from the hand of one assailant. Watson immediately closed the distance, pointing his revolver at the man's chest. The figure's mask fell, revealing a gaunt, weathered face, eyes wild with fury, but also fear. The other man, his companion, stepped back, his own weapon still drawn, but hesitating. "This is over," Holmes said, his voice low and final. "You've lost." The man's face twisted into a scowl, his eyes darting between Holmes and Watson. "You think you've won?" he sneered, before his gaze turned to Thorne. "You have no idea what you've just stopped, Mr. Holmes. But you will. In time, you all will." Before Holmes could respond, the figure turned abruptly and darted toward the door, disappearing into the hall with surprising speed. The other man, still hesitant, followed after him without another word, leaving the library in a stunned silence. Holmes's shoulders sagged slightly, but his eyes remained sharp. That, Watson, was but a small taste of what is to come. But let's make no mistake, the game has changed. Thorne, his face pale and shaken, stepped forward. "What did they mean? What is this all about, Holmes?" Holmes sighed deeply, his eyes drifting toward the empty space where the amulet had once rested. "That, my friend, is a question we are only beginning to answer." The mystery had taken another dark turn, and there were no easy answers left. The pursuit of the truth would lead them deeper into a world of secrecy and danger, where every answer only raised more questions. And somewhere, in the shadows, the ritual was still, waiting to be completed. The web tightens. The cold night air outside the library seemed to press in on them as Holmes, Watson, and Thorne stepped into the dimly lit street. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around them in oppressive tendrils that obscured the lamps and made the world seem smaller, more insular. Watson could feel the weight of the mystery pressing on his chest, a sensation that had not left him since the first cryptic words from the masked men. Holmes stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the mist as though searching for something just beyond the edges of sight. His long fingers tightened around the brim of his hat, a habit that always surfaced when he was deep in thought. "There is more to this than a mere treasure hunt or occult ritual, Watson," Holmes finally said, his voice cutting through the silence. "We are dealing with something far older, far more dangerous than I initially suspected." Watson glanced at Thorne, who was now pacing back and forth, his face etched with anxiety. The man's agitation was palpable, but Watson knew better than to ask him to elaborate. He seemed too shaken to offer any coherent explanations. Instead, Watson turned his attention back to Holmes. "Do you think the amulet itself is truly the key to all this, Holmes? Or is it merely a tool, a symbol for something else?" Holmes did not immediately respond, but when he did, his tone was grave. "I believe the amulet is central, Watson, but not in the way we initially imagined. It is not the object of desire, it is the means to an end." Holmes's gaze shifted toward Thorne, who had ceased his pacing to stand at the foot of the steps. "Mr. Thorne, I suspect you know more about this than you have let on. I'm not inclined to believe your previous claims of ignorance." Thorne flinched, clearly taken aback by Holmes's directness. For a moment, he opened his mouth as though to protest, but then he stopped, his eyes darkening with what seemed to be a mixture of fear and resolve. "Holmes, I told you the truth. The amulet was a family heirloom, passed down through generations, but that's all I know of its significance. And yet, Holmes continued, his voice a calm whip, crack, you seem to have an uncanny connection to the ritual itself. Why would they come for you, Mr. Thorne? Why would those men seek you out specifically? Thorne's face turned pale, and his hands trembled ever so slightly as he folded his arms tightly against his chest. I don't know. I told you, I never wanted any of this, but they kept saying things to me, warnings, threats. They said I had no choice. The fog thickened as Holmes turned and began walking down the street, his footsteps echoing sharply in the silent night. Watson followed, and Thorne reluctantly trailed behind. No choice, Holmes repeated, his voice thoughtful, almost to himself. That's quite an interesting notion, Mr. Thorne. You see, it suggests that this ritual is far more than some arcane pursuit of power. It implies a necessity, a compulsion. Compulsion? Watson asked, his brow furrowing. What are you suggesting, Holmes? I suggest, Watson, Holmes said, his eyes fixed ahead, that the amulet is not simply a key. It is a trap set by those who understand far more about its true power than we could ever hope to know. And I fear, Mr. Thorne, you may have been the unwitting bait. The three of them walked in silence for several more minutes, the sound of their footsteps the only noise that seemed to break through the oppressive fog. Watson felt unease settle in his stomach. The pieces were coming together in a way that neither of them could yet fully understand, and Holmes seemed to be leading them into the very heart of something much darker than anticipated. They reached a narrow alleyway, the kind Holmes often favoured when in pursuit of a suspect or clue. The thick fog hung like a shroud, and it felt as though the world outside this alley no longer existed. Holmes stopped at the mouth of the alley and turned to face Thorne. Mr. Thorne, I need you to answer one more question, Holmes said, his voice soft but intense. Have you ever heard the phrase, the dead man's prophecy? Thorne's face twisted, as though he had just tasted something foul. He looked down at the ground for a moment, his breath shallow. I don't know. I've heard whispers, rumours, but nothing solid, nothing I can be sure of. Holmes's gaze did not waver. Rumours, Mr. Thorne? Or perhaps something more substantial? Thorne hesitated. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant tolling of a church bell in the distance, marking the hour. It was something my father used to speak of, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something about an ancient prophecy tied to the amulet. But my father, he was a man who dabbled in strange things. I didn't want to listen. He warned me, but I never took him seriously. Warnings? Watson asked, now fully engaged. What kind of warnings? Thorne shook his head, his brow furrowing. I don't know. It was all so cryptic. He said that the amulet had been used before, for something terrible. He said there were forces beyond our comprehension that could be unleashed if it fell into the wrong hands. But it's all just legends, isn't it? Holmes was silent for a long time, staring at Thorne with an expression that was impossible to read. Finally he spoke. Legends, Mr. Thorne, are often based on truths we are not yet ready to face. And I believe your father's warnings are not merely the product of an overactive imagination. Holmes turned back to the alley, his eyes scanning, the shadows as though searching for something hidden within them. "We must be cautious, Watson. There are more pieces to this puzzle than we have yet discovered, and I fear we are being watched." Before Watson could respond, a movement in the mist caught Holmes's attention. His body stiffened, and his eyes narrowed. Watson followed his gaze, but there was nothing, no one visible in the alley. "I trust you have your weapon, Watson?" Holmes asked quietly, his voice tense. Watson's hand instinctively moved to his side, where his revolver rested. "Yes, Holmes. But who do you suspect?" Holmes was already moving forward, his stride purposeful. "That, Watson, is what we need to determine." The fog shifted once more, a gust of wind carrying with it the sound of distant footsteps. But whether they belonged to friend or foe, Holmes could not yet tell. They were getting closer, Watson realized, closer to unraveling the mystery. But with every step, it was becoming clearer that the web they had stepped into was far more tangled, far more dangerous than any of them could have predicted. The trap is set. The mist was heavier now, clinging to their clothes like wet cobwebs, as Holmes led the way deeper into the narrow alley. Watson had long since stopped asking questions, his mind racing with the strange revelations that seemed to surface with every word Holmes spoke. Despite his best efforts, he could not shake the sense of dread that had settled in his chest. Something was closing in on them, something far more dangerous than mere criminals or thieves. Holmes, as always, seemed immune to the growing tension. His eyes were sharp, scanning the alley with the precision of a hawk, his mind already several steps ahead of any potential danger. Watson couldn't help but marvel at his colleague's unshakable focus, even as the air thickened around them. "Holmes, do you really believe Thorne is innocent in all this?" Watson asked quietly, his voice cutting through the otherwise silent night. "He seems to be hiding something." Holmes glanced back at him, a slight smirk on his lips. "I believe, Watson, that Mr. Thorne is hiding the truth, but not in the way you think. He has been entangled in something far larger than himself, an ancient, sinister plot that he could not escape, even if he wanted to." Watson's brow furrowed. "You mean he's being manipulated?" Holmes nodded, but his eyes remained fixed ahead, searching the shadows with an almost uncanny precision. "Precisely. But manipulation is only part of the story. There is something else at play here, something older and more powerful than simple human intent." Before Watson could respond, Holmes halted suddenly. He held up his hand, signalling for silence. The sharp click of his boots on the cobblestone had faded, replaced by a sound that chilled Watson's blood, the unmistakable creak of a door opening somewhere in the mist ahead. Holmes's expression darkened. "We're not alone, Watson. Stay close." They moved forward with greater caution now, each footstep deliberate, as though the very ground beneath them might betray their presence. As they reached the mouth of the alley, Holmes gestured toward a small unmarked door at the far end. It was cracked slightly open, and the faintest glow of candlelight could be seen flickering from inside. "Stay here," Holmes whispered, his eyes narrowing. "I'm going to investigate. If anything goes wrong, you know what to do." Watson nodded, his hand resting on his revolver once more. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he watched Holmes slip silently into the shadows, disappearing from view as if he had become one with the fog. Time seemed to stretch as Watson waited, the silence around him growing more oppressive by the second. Every creak of the wooden door seemed amplified. Every shift of the mist seemed to hold a deeper meaning. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, but he knew better than to intervene. Holmes was the master of these situations. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was him. Several minutes passed, and Watson began to wonder if Holmes had encountered some unforeseen obstacle. Then, just as doubt began to creep into his thoughts, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of muffled voices, low and hurried, coming from within the building. Holmes was in there, and it seemed as though he was speaking to someone. Watson tensed, instinctively moving closer to the door, straining to catch any fragment of the conversation. He could make out only a few words. Fragments, really. Phrases like the prophecy and the ritual. Words that sent a chill down his spine. The conversation seemed to be growing more heated, and Watson's instinct screamed at him that they were on the verge of something dangerous. The door creaked open a fraction more, just enough for Watson to glimpse Holmes standing in the doorway, his posture tense but controlled. He was speaking to someone, but the man, dressed in dark robes, was mostly obscured in the dim light. Holmes was engaged in a quiet but animated exchange, his face set in the firm expression Watson had come to associate with the moments before he uncovered a crucial piece of the puzzle. Watson moved closer, hoping for more clarity. Then, as if sensing his presence, Holmes's eyes flicked towards the alley entrance. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and Watson could see the unmistakable signal in Holmes's eyes. A silent warning. Something was about to happen. In a flash, Holmes moved, pushing the robed man backward into the room with a force that sent him stumbling. Watson drew his revolver in a fluid motion, just as two more figures emerged from the shadows, their movements swift and silent as they closed in on Holmes. The trap had been sprung. Watson acted without hesitation. He darted forward, his revolver raised, but the figures had already anticipated this move. One of them lunged at him, knocking the weapon from his grasp with a swift, practiced strike. Watson grunted in surprise, quickly recovering his balance as he instinctively reached for the knife tucked beneath his coat. But before the struggle could escalate, Holmes's voice cut through the chaos. "Watson! Move to the left, now!" In an instant, Watson obeyed, sidestepping just as Holmes ducked beneath an incoming blow. The robed man, who had been thrown back, rose to his feet and lunged toward Holmes. But it was clear from the movement that Holmes had already calculated his opponent's next move. With the precision only Holmes could muster, he grabbed the man by the wrist and twisted it in a way that caused the robed figure to cry out in pain. Holmes spun, using the momentum to slam the man into the nearby wall, knocking him unconscious in a single, swift motion. The remaining two attackers hesitated for a fraction of a second, but that was all Holmes needed. With a flick of his wrist, he drew a hidden blade from his sleeve and thrust it toward the second assailant, narrowly, missing the man's throat but making it clear that he would not hesitate to take a life if necessary. Watson, now fully armed with his revolver once more, dispatched the last assailant with a well-aimed shot that left the man crumpled to the ground. The alley fell silent once again, save for the gasps of the defeated attackers. Holmes stood over, Them, his chest heaving with the exertion, but his expression was one of grim satisfaction. "That was only the beginning," he muttered, wiping the blade clean before slipping it back into his coat. "We have more pressing matters to attend to." Watson felt a cold chill crawl down his spine as Holmes's words sank in. Despite the violent confrontation, they had only scratched the surface of the danger that lay ahead. And the real mystery, the true nature of the dead man's prophecy, was still waiting to be uncovered. The final confrontation. The door creaked, closed behind them with a faint groan, sealing them inside the dim, musty room. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, warping the already unsettling space into something otherworldly. It was a far cry from the well-lit drawing rooms and bustling streets of London. This was a place steeped in silence, in secrets, and in the kind of forgotten history that seemed to gnaw at the edges of one's sanity. Holmes led the way, his steps deliberate as he moved deeper into the heart of the building. Watson followed, his revolver still clutched tightly in his hand, though the feeling of dread in the pit of his stomach made it feel heavier with every passing moment. The room they entered was filled with ancient bookshelves, their contents obscured by the thick layer of dust that covered them. The air smelled faintly of mildew and decaying paper, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the wind outside. It was a place forgotten by time, yet filled with an unmistakable presence, a presence that had been lingering for far longer than either of them could understand. Holmes paused near a large wooden desk in the centre of the room. Holmes wasted no time. He rushed forward, grabbing the man by the arm and throwing him to the ground. The man struggled beneath him, but Holmes's grip was like iron. "Watson!" Holmes shouted as he wrestled the man down. "The book! There's a book on the desk. The one with the red binding. Open it, now!" Watson didn't hesitate. He dashed to the desk, flipping through the pages of the ancient tome until he found the section that Holmes had indicated. The words were written in a language he didn't recognize, but the symbols on the pages were all too familiar. They matched the ones on the map, the ones that had appeared in the cryptic symbols that had been driving the mystery. Holmes, still, holding the man down, glanced over at Watson. "Read it aloud, Watson! Quickly!" With no time to question, Watson did as instructed. As the ancient words left his lips, the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, and the shadows on the walls twisted unnaturally, as though they were alive. The man beneath Holmes's grip let out a strangled cry, his body convulsing as though something inside him was fighting to escape. Then, with a final guttural scream, he fell limp, his body going cold and still. Holmes stood, wiping his hands on his coat. The room fell silent again, save for the faint sound of the wind rattling against the windows. "That, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "was the end of the prophecy." But even as he spoke, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the darkness, watching them from just beyond the edge of the light. The mystery was solved, but the danger was far from over. The unseen hand, the faint echoes of their footsteps reverberated in the cold, empty corridor as Holmes and Watson made their way toward the exit. The oppressive silence that had followed, the conclusion of the ritual was unsettling, as if the very air itself had been altered by the dark forces they had just confronted. Watson, his mind still racing, felt the weight of what they had just witnessed pressing down on him. He had expected closure, but instead there was a lingering sense of unease. "Holmes," Watson began, breaking the silence between them, "do you truly believe it's over, that man?" He seemed to be just a pawn in something much greater. Holmes didn't respond immediately. His face remained impassive, but Watson could see the slight tension in his posture. Holmes was rarely one to let his guard down. Watson had learned long ago that when Holmes appeared calm, it was often because he was simply not ready to reveal the depths of his thoughts. As they reached the door that led outside, Holmes stopped and turned, his sharp gaze scanning the shadows around them. It was as though he had sensed something Watson hadn't. "Not over, Watson," Holmes said, his voice quieter than usual. "There is more at play here. We've uncovered a portion of the puzzle, but the true mastermind remains hidden. And I am quite certain that they are watching us now." Watson felt a chill crawl up his spine. His hand instinctively moved to his revolver, though he knew it would do little good against whatever unseen force they were up against. The case had started with a seemingly simple prophecy, but as it had unravelled, it had grown into something far more complex, something that even Holmes had not fully anticipated. "We need to leave London," Watson said, his voice edged with concern. "If the prophecy was not fully prevented, if there's more at stake here, we may be walking directly into their trap." Holmes considered this, his eyes narrowing, as he thought. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "but running would give them exactly what they want, more time to manipulate the situation. No, Watson, we must remain in London. We must confront this at its source." Before Watson could reply, a sudden movement caught his attention. From the corner of his eye, he saw something. A shadow darting across the hallway, disappearing into one of the darker alcoves. His heart skipped a beat, and his hand instinctively gripped the revolver tighter. "Did you see that?" Watson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Holmes raised a hand, signalling for silence. His keen eyes never left the darkness that lay ahead, his senses alert, as if he were listening for the very pulse of the city itself. "I did," Holmes said softly. "It's them. They know we're onto them." There was no more time to waste. Holmes began walking toward the shadow, his movements deliberate and confident, though Watson could see the quiet intensity in his eyes. Holmes was used to danger, but this was different. This was not just a physical threat. It was a battle of minds, a game of strategy and deception. And in this game, one wrong move could cost them everything. As they reached the alcove, Holmes turned to Watson. "Stay close," he whispered. "Do not let your guard down for a second. These people are not merely concerned with their own survival. They are willing to risk everything to achieve their goals." Watson nodded, his pulse quickening. He had seen Holmes face down criminals, and he had witnessed his brilliance in solving the most perplexing of mysteries. But this felt different. This was not simply a matter of intellect, it was a matter of life and death, of something far darker and older than either of them could fully comprehend. They reached the alcove and Holmes stopped abruptly. He motioned for Watson to look at the ground. There, in the dust-covered floor, was a small object, something that had been deliberately placed there. Holmes bent down, examining it closely. It was a coin, old and worn, with an intricate design that appeared to be a symbol of some kind. A symbol Watson had seen before, but couldn't quite place. His mind raced, trying to make the connection, but it was as though the answer was just out of reach. "This," Holmes said, holding the coin up to the dim light, "is no ordinary coin. It is a calling card, a signal. They are trying to send us a message." "A message?" Watson asked, feeling a growing sense of dread. "Who?" "Monsieur Dodeur," didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pocketed the coin and stood up, his mind clearly racing. "The question is not who is sending it, Watson. The question is why now? Why leave a clue at all when they know we're on to them?" Watson swallowed hard, his thoughts spinning. Could it be a trap? A way to lure us into a false sense of security? Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile, though there was no humour in it. "Exactly. But they're making a mistake. They underestimate us." Before Watson could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Someone was approaching, and they were moving swiftly. Holmes signalled for Watson to follow him into a nearby room, where they hid in the shadows, their breathing slow and measured. The footsteps grew louder, and a figure appeared in the doorway, cloaked in shadows. It was a tall man, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "Don't move," Holmes whispered to Watson. "Stay low." The man paused just outside the door, his eyes scanning the hallway with a sharpness that sent a chill through Watson's body. There was something unnervingly familiar about the figure, though Watson couldn't place where he had seen him before. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if sensing something, the man turned sharply and walked away, his footsteps receding down the hallway. Holmes exhaled slowly, his body relaxing slightly. "Not a trap," he muttered under his breath. "At least, not yet." Watson could barely believe what he had just witnessed. "Who was that?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "I believe that, my dear Watson, was the man we've been searching for. The one behind the prophecy, the one pulling the strings." Watson's mind raced, trying to process the information. "Then we've found him." Holmes nodded, his expression grim. "Not quite, but we are closer than ever. And now, Watson, we must prepare for the final confrontation." As Holmes and Watson made their way back into the shadows, the sense of impending danger grew ever more palpable. There was no longer any question. They were in the heart of the storm, and soon the storm would break. The final revelation. The tension was palpable in the cold, dimly lit room. Holmes and Watson had returned to Baker Street, the coin they had found earlier lying heavily between them on the table. The game had played out, but there was still one last piece to place, one last thread to tie together before the puzzle could be completed. Holmes, as always, was the picture of calmness. His fingers traced the edges of the coin slowly, as though the answer was hidden in its intricate design. Watson, pacing the floor, felt a knot in his stomach. Every instinct he had screamed that they were closing in on something important, yet something about the whole affair still unsettled him. They had gotten so close, but there were too many shadows lingering, too many questions that didn't have answers yet. "Holmes, do you honestly think we'll find the mastermind behind it all today?" Watson asked, his voice edged with frustration. The man we saw in the hallway was clearly involved, but— "I know, Watson," Holmes interrupted, his sharp eyes locking onto the coin. "The pieces are falling into place, and yet there is one final twist to unravel." He stood up abruptly, his long, lean figure casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the room. Watson's gaze followed him as Holmes crossed to the window, staring out into the foggy streets below. "You see, Watson," Holmes continued, his voice calm but with an undertone of intensity. "The man we saw earlier, the one whose footsteps we heard, it wasn't a random figure. It wasn't just another suspect. It was the man who orchestrated the entire scheme." Watson's heart skipped a beat. "But how can you be so sure? We've had so many false leads already." Holmes gave him a sidelong glance, his expression unreadable. "Because, my dear Watson, the man who wanted to stop the prophecy, the one whose death we sought to prevent, was not the victim, nor the one who tried to escape. He was the very man who set it all in motion." Watson blinked in confusion, his mind trying to piece together the puzzle that seemed so elusive. "But you've said before that the man who died was merely a pawn." Holmes turned, a spark of clarity in his eyes. "Exactly. The real mastermind used the prophecy to hide his tracks, and in doing so, he masked his identity. The clues we've followed, all the misdirections, have been carefully constructed to lead us astray. The coin," he held it up between his fingers, "is the final key." Watson frowned, his eyes narrowing. "You're saying the coin is a clue?" "A very important one," Holmes replied. "If you look closely, you'll see that it is a coin from the Royal Mint, but the design is altered. A subtle change, almost imperceptible." He placed the coin under the lamp, and Watson peered closely at the engraving. There, beneath the surface, was the faint imprint of a family crest, one Watson had seen before, on the letter that had arrived earlier in the case. "It's from the Atherton family," Holmes declared, his voice low but certain. "A family with a history that few know about, and fewer still dare to speak of." Watson felt the weight of realization settle in his chest. The Athertons were an old aristocratic family, long believed to be tainted by scandal and mystery. The last of their line had been a recluse, barely seen in public for years. Could it be possible that the family was at the heart of this? Was one of them the puppet master? "This doesn't make sense," Watson muttered, his thoughts racing. "The Athertons. But why? What do they have to gain from all of this?" Holmes turned sharply, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. "Everything, Watson. The prophecy was never about preventing a death. It was about securing a future where the Atherton name would once again rise to prominence, hidden beneath the cloak of secrecy. The true mastermind was none other than Lord Reginald Atherton, the last surviving member of the family." Watson froze. "Lord Reginald?" His mind struggled to reconcile the revelation. "But he's been dead for years. That's what they want you to think," Holmes said with quiet satisfaction. "Reginald Atherton never died. He staged his death, faked his own funeral, and went into hiding under a different name. The Atherton family's name had been tarnished beyond repair, and Reginald saw only one way to restore it, through power, influence, and the careful manipulation of others. He used the prophecy as a smokescreen to cover his tracks, orchestrating, the death of his supposed successor in order to take his place, quietly regaining control over everything. Watson's mind swam as he pieced together the implications. Lord Reginald Atherton had orchestrated the entire series of events, manipulating everyone, from the supposed victim to the obscure family relics. The prophecy had been a lie from the start, a way to distract the authorities and divert suspicion while he moved unnoticed in the shadows. "But how did you know?" Watson asked, incredulous. Holmes smiled, a rare, satisfied smile. "Because, Watson, when I examined the evidence, from the beginning I noticed something odd about the victim's will. It wasn't just a will. It was a coded message, a desperate attempt by the deceased to warn us. The symbols that seemed meaningless were actually part of the family crest. When I cross-referenced the designs, I found the missing piece. Lord Reginald's signature." Watson let out a sharp breath, his mind catching up. So, the prophecy. It was all for nothing. The victim's death was part of a much larger scheme. Holmes nodded gravely. "Indeed. And now, Watson, we must bring Lord Reginald to justice for the crimes he has committed and the lies he has spun." The final confrontation was swift, and though Lord Reginald was a man of considerable means, he was no match for the precision of Holmes's intellect. The web of deceit unravelled quickly once Holmes presented his evidence to the authorities, and Reginald, his face contorted with rage, was apprehended before he could make his escape. As the detective stood over the bound figure of the notorious aristocrat, Watson couldn't help but reflect on the profound intricacies of the case. They had unravelled not just a murder mystery, but a legacy of manipulation and deception that had spanned years. Later that evening, as Watson sat in the familiar warmth of the Baker Street apartment, Holmes leaned back in his chair, looking out the window with a distant gaze. "Well, Watson," Holmes said after a long silence, "another case closed, but I can't help but feel a twinge of regret. Such potential wasted. A family once great, now reduced to this." Watson nodded, understanding what Holmes meant. A great tragedy. Holmes turned to him with a slight smile, his eyes twinkling. "Indeed. But that, my dear Watson, is the nature of all human endeavour. Nothing is perfect, and all things must eventually come to an end." As Watson left the room to prepare for bed, he could not help but admire his friend's unshakable calmness, even in the face of such complexity. Holmes, as always, had seen the solution before anyone else, and in doing so had once again proved that no mystery, no matter how dark or twisted, was beyond his comprehension.